Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we've got a pretty cracking schedule lined up. We're going to be taking a look of course at World Update 12, the New Zealand World Update, as well as the newly released De Havilland DHC-4 Caribou. The video itself is primarily going to be a review of the Caribou, but of course it offers up a great opportunity as well to check out the most recent World Update. I was really happy to see New Zealand get some care and attention from a Sobo. I'm sure I've probably said this a few times previously, but New Zealand is without a doubt one of my favourite places to go flying in the sim. A few hours ago I couldn't have said quite the same about the Caribou. It's never been an aircraft that I've been particularly fond of. De Havilland have of course been responsible for some of the most beautiful aircraft designs in existence, but to me it's always seemed as though perhaps when they were making the DHC-4 the usual designers had the day off. The Caribou is not a pretty aircraft by anybody's standards. I was somewhat tentative when it came to checking out the DHC-4, but spoiler alert, the aircraft is actually great fun. I had a really enjoyable outing. There was a lot more fidelity there than I was expecting, and it made for a pretty special trip. In terms of that trip, we are currently on the ground at Tekapo Airport, which is one of the new handcrafted airports within the sim. We're going to be taking the Caribou on a fairly short hop over towards Queenstown, so crossing over New Zealand's South Island. Obviously we can discuss more about the flight and the routing as we go, but long story short, this was one of those experiences in the sim where everything came together really nicely and made for rather a special experience. As ever, as we carry out our flight, I'll try my best to give you a detailed breakdown of what the De Havilland DHC-4 Caribou has to offer. I do hope you enjoy the video. We'll start with a brief walk around and then we'll make our way up to the cockpit. As always, if you do enjoy things, then please consider giving the video a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. So just making our way over towards the DHC-4, the Caribou. Overall, as I mentioned during the introduction, I was actually really pleasantly surprised by the aircraft. I had an absolutely cracking flight. But first off, we'll start by taking a look, of course, at the external model in a little bit more detail. Starting with the nose wheel then. As you can see, overall nice detailing. You can see the linkages there, a couple of wires as well. Texturing is a little bit lower resolution than one might hope for in certain areas, but overall I think the aircraft looks really nice. And again, the texture detail is good. You can see there, for example, on the prop, everything quite legible. Nice detail as well there with the radial engine. Overall, I think the Caribou is a really nice 3D model externally, I have to say. Just taking a look here down the wing as well. We'll make our way around towards the main landing gear. Nice riveting detail as well. Again, the texturing just slightly lower quality textures. Slightly strange texturing there on the tire as well. But it's one of those add-ons. It might not be the most high resolution textures that are being used, but they certainly look the part. The aircraft looks very nicely weathered, very nicely rendered. Up at the tail there, again, that Canadian flag sits perfectly within the New Zealand scenery. And coming around to the rear of the aircraft, which I suppose currently within the sim is the DHC-4's party piece. Those engines as well look pretty beastly there with those two exhausts coming off the back. We'll just jump up onto the cargo ramp and making our way through the rear hold. Pretty cool that we now have an aircraft in the sim with a set of rear doors and an operable cargo ramp. You can see we're configured currently, it looks like, for a parachute drop. And just working our way through the rear of the cabin. Again, very nice detailing in terms of modelling and texturing. And making our way up into the flight deck. So here we are now then in the cockpit of the DHC-4 Caribou here on the ground in Tekapo. Just coming up on about 5 PM local time. Overall, I have to say, a very nice job with the cockpit. Rather antiquated, of course, in terms of design, but that makes it very interesting to operate. And there's lots of nice details included as well, which of course we'll take a look at as we go. First things first though, we'll get that rear cargo door closed up, so the battery master can go on. And the controls for the cargo door is located here at the aft of the cockpit. So ramp down can go off, we can cage that up. We can close up the cargo doors themselves and we can start retracting the ramp. And you can hear really nice sounds there associated with the operation of the doors and the ramp. And overall I have to say the sound set of the aircraft is very good. Indeed, the level of detail throughout the aircraft is very good, especially given the price. So of course we're just waiting here for everything to close up. There go the doors, cage up the switch. Just before we do that we can put that back to the off position. And the ramp there taking a little bit longer, but you can see it just coming in now. So there goes the ramp. Once again, we'll switch that to the off position, cage it up, and we can turn off the master power switch. Also back here as well, not really necessary for the flight today, but we might as well get the no smoking and the fasten seatbelt signs on. So the ramp is closed up, running through the before start checks. The landing gear ground safety locks have been removed. Pewter head covers, we checked there on the walk around, they've been removed. Wheel chocks have been removed, the fire guard is posted, the props, obviously again already checked during the walk around there, but they should be clear. And they look to be visually clear. The battery master switch is on. For our caution and warning lights, we're looking for hydraulic low pressure warning lights, which we have. Landing gear down indications, we have 3 greens. Fuel low pressure lights, more low pressure lights. Generator failure and inverter failure, so all of our lights working correctly. According to the checklist, we carry out a landing gear horn test. The switch does work, doesn't seem to do anything though in the cockpit. Throttles we can open up to the gust lock position. So you can see there the gust lock holding the throttles at a set position. Again, nice details overall, I would say. We're not going to be using external power for the start, so we'll be starting off the batteries, starting the left-hand engine first. So left fuel booster pump switch can go on. And you might just about as well be able to hear the whine there of the fuel pump. You can see we do have an increase there in fuel pressure. Inverter switch can go over to main. And there we're just checking that the manifold pressures register, which they do. And same there as well for the fuel quantities. So switch off once again. We're going to run through a slightly adjusted start process here versus the checklist, really for the sake of simplicity in the video. So anti-collision light can go on. Nav lights can go on. Coming down to the start panel, the start master is selected on. Fuel boost pump, once again selected to normal, and the low fuel pressure warning light is out. Mags on the left engine can go on to both. We'll set the mixture through to auto rich. And we'll prime on the left, and we'll engage the left starter. So there goes the engine. It does fire up rather easily, it has to be said. We'll bring the throttle back. We're looking for around 800 RPM initially. The start sounds aren't too bad. It would be nice, of course, to have a little bit more coughing and spluttering and the engine taking a little bit longer to catch. But that generally tends to be the case in the sim, that there's not too much nuance to radial engine starts. Anyway, low oil pressure warning lights out. The oil pressure indication looks good. And the RPMs are set. And again, just coming back down to the start panel, we'll get the primer off, starters disengaged. And we do have a good start there on the left, so we'll bring the mixture lever back to the auto lean position. Doing the same then for the right hand engine. Once again, the master is on. Fuel boost pump on the left can go to the off position, and on the right can go through to normal. Mags are set through to both. Mixture is through to auto rich, and now priming on the right. And we'll start the right engine. So again, good start there on the right. Oil pressure has come up, oil pressure warning light is out, so 2 good starts. Once again, the boost pump can go off, and the primer can come off. Start's disconnected. Master start switch can go off. And for the after start, once again we do have good oil pressures. Inverter switch can go back to main. The boost pump switches are off. And now we have a good start. We can get both generators on there as well. So left gen on. And same there on the right. Just come up slightly now on the RPMs, let the engine start warming up. We're looking for around 1200 RPM and an oil temperature of 40 degrees. And already there showing up around 50 degrees, bang on in the green band, so we'll just leave the engines idling around 1000 RPM. The before taxi checks then, inverter and generators are set. Now looking for the low oil pressure warning lights out. Windshield heat, unfortunately inoperative in the aircraft. Troop jump lights are out. Low fuel level warning lights are out. Fuel quantity indicating system is checked. We've got about 1700 pounds there in each main tank. Communications equipment and navigation radio set. So for nav 1 today, we want initially the Mount Mary VOR. According to Sky Vector, it's a VOR. According to Navigraph, it's a DME only. But anyway, it's 1125. And you can see there we are picking up the DME. We'll initially track on a heading out for that, and the course is going to be 201. We'll set that, but again, if it is just a DME, we're obviously not going to pick anything up there, and it doesn't look as though we're picking up any information from the station. Anyway, just take our time here to select 201 on the OBS. There's 201. Altimeters, set those. QNH is 1026 by the looks of things. Aerodrome elevation there showing 2,600 feet. It's about 2,500 in reality, aerodrome elevation here at Tekapo, so a slight discrepancy there. Probably an issue with the Sims live weather. We'll set 2,500 for now. And we'll do the same there on the right. Heading bug we can set once we're out at the runway. So nav radios and communication radios are set. A slightly interesting avionics setup here. It's more of a military style avionics setup. So we've got, for example, the IFF, UHF radio, TACAN. Most of that functionality isn't operable, including the TACAN. But we do have ADFs and nav radios. And again, we'll be making use of the nav radio today. Similarly, we do have a GPS, which is nice. So just cycling through, we'll wait for that to initialize. And we do have the option as well to select between both nav and GPS for the navigation, as you can see. As far as I can tell, no autopilot in the aircraft, so a lot of manual flying for today's flight, and indeed if you do purchase the Caribou, there's going to be a lot of manual flying for you as well. We'll keep things simple for now. We might change the plan later on, but for now we'll just go direct to Queenstown. So November, Zulu, Quebec. November. And Queenstown. So we can activate that, and you can see we're showing direct to the destination currently. We'll again refine our selections later on there. Just come out as well on the range. You can see Mount Mary showing as a VOR there as well on the GPS, quite interesting. Anyway, communications and navigation equipment is set. Flight and engine instruments are checked, everything reading nicely there now in terms of oil pressure, fuel pressure. All of our readings are green. The hydraulics, we're supposed to be showing 3,000 psi, interestingly only showing around 2,000 currently. I have noticed that does tend to come up once we come up on the engine power, so we'll check that again later on, but a slight discrepancy there. The wheel chocks have been removed, the cargo and passenger doors, once again just visually verifying those are closed, and getting our signal there from the ground chief. So we are now ready for the taxi. That being said, we're just going to carry out the run up here today in our present position. Just for the sake of the video, really, it keeps things a little bit more simple. Not quite into wind. As you can see, we have a nice headwind there down the easterly runway. But again, for the sake of the video today, we'll carry out the run up here, and then we'll make our way out towards the runway. So for the engine run up, once again, we'll say we are clear, coming up to 1200 RPM. There's 1200 set, and again, temperatures and pressures looking good. Check the wing flaps. So selecting full flaps, the flap indicator just down by the airspeed indicator, and indicating flaps 40 will come all the way back on the flaps again. Okay, for the gust lock handle, we can unlock that. I think there's potentially a bit of a bug here. We have the lock position, the controls lock position, and the unlocked position. We only seem to be able to select through to the controls lock position, and the flight controls do work at that point. I'm not entirely sure though, that could be a misunderstanding on my part. Anyway, with the gust lock removed, we can now come up to 1900 RPM. And there we have 1900. We'll check the props. According to the checklist, we should see the props come back towards 1300 RPM. Really there we only come back to around 1700, so again a little bit of a discrepancy. And we'll cycle that 3 times. Nevertheless, we do see a decrease there in prop. It'll be interesting to see how the props behave later on. With the carpeets, they don't seem to work off my default keybind. We'll just try those individually. You can see we do show a drop there on the left. So the carpeet's functioning correctly. And same there on the right. So carpeets are checked, now through to 2200 RPM. And we'll check the mags. We should see as well that the manifold pressure roughly reading aerodrome elevation barometric pressure, which we pretty much have there, we're just below 30 inches. Slight drop there on the left. Back to both. And again, same drop there, within limits. And on the right engine we'll do the same. Slight drop. Back to both. That switch looks perhaps a little bit misaligned in terms of its animation. Same again. And back to both. The thrust indications there, checking that they both read broadly the same value, which they do. Interestingly, you can see we do have takeoff, climb and cruise parameters. We'll see how closely our power settings align with those later on. So max to check, we're looking for no less than 100 RPM drop and max differential of 40. So we were within limits. And now coming back on the throttles, we're looking to idle around 550 RPM plus or minus 25. Just coming slowly back on those throttles with those big radial engines. Probably still a little bit too fast here in reality, but we'll try and keep things somewhat expeditious for the video. And you can see there, idling around 650, so ever so slightly high, but again, still well within limits for what I would expect to see at this sort of price point. We should also see the generator warning lights there come on as the generators drop out, but that's really the sort of icing on the cake type of stuff, and again, at this sort of price, I'm not expecting that necessarily. So back up to 1000 RPM. Carb air induction switches are unfortunately inoperative, but we'll leave those in alternate anyway. And whilst I remember, whilst we're down here as well, we'll just turn on our bearing and waypoint indicator. So carb air induction switches will leave. Coming to reverse on the props. And we have good indications, prop reverse lights are illuminated. And once again, coming out of reverse. And bringing ourselves back towards 1200 RPM. So that's the run up complete. The auto feather switch selected on, the light is illuminated. Gas lock. Once again we'll move into the locked position for the taxi out. And mixture control levers. A little bit of a mission there on my part, we'll just bring the right hand lever there back towards the auto lean position as well. We should have had those up in the auto rich position for the run up. Anyway, we are now ready for the taxi. Again, we've got a pretty decent headwind here off the easterly runway, so we're going to taxi straight ahead here, otherwise it's a little bit tight in terms of getting around the terminal building. As I say, we'll taxi straight ahead, we'll backtrack out towards the north, we'll get ourselves turned around at the turning node, and then we'll be ready to go. Okay, so we are nicely lined up here now on runway 11, just running through our before takeoff checks. For the trims, Elevator trim is set in the takeoff band. Aileron and rudder trim both set neutral. The carb air induction switches both set to alternate. But the flaps will come through to flaps 20. The Caribou is a pretty capable aircraft, but we're fairly limited here in terms of runway out of Tekapo, so we'll go with flaps 20 for the takeoff. And we'll hold the aircraft on the brakes as well as we initially come up on the power. So flaps are set, mixture control levers are set through to fully rich, props are set fully forward, auto feather is selected on, fuel boost pumps are set to normal, fuel tank selector is set to normal, showing about 1650 there now in each main tank. Windshield heat, again unfortunately currently inoperative. Hydraulic pressure showing 2000 psi still, again expecting to see 3000. Anti-collision light is on, engine instruments are checked, all warning lights are out. Flight instruments, still showing 2500 there on both altimeters, which checks with the aerodrome elevation, and showing 110 there on the directional gyro versus 110 on the whiskey compass. We've also set the heading bug there as well. 201 for the initial course, and as I say, we are picking up that DME. So flight instruments are checked, flap position indicating flaps 20. We're supposed to carry out stall warning system test. Again, the switch does operate, but I can't see any associated effect with that. Pitot heat can go on. Windows are closed and locked. Unfortunately, the windows don't seem to be operable, which is a bit of a shame, given the level of detail in the aircraft. It would have been a nice feature to have. The emergency overhead escape hatch is also closed and locked. And again, I really love the level of detail throughout the Caribou. I think it's a really nice job overall. So parking brake can come off. Again, we'll just hold the aircraft on the brakes. So releasing the gust lock once again. Checking we are full and free on the flight controls, which we are. Shoulder harness is locked, and we are good for the takeoff. So as I say, we'll initially come up on the power, just holding the aircraft on the brakes, trying to minimise our takeoff ground roll. Like the aircraft holding on the brakes there right through to takeoff power. There's full power, off the brakes. Manifold pressure looks good, RPMs are checked. The wind just wanting to push us out to the left there, so correcting for that. So far the aircraft pretty easy to control on the takeoff. Seems to be pretty stable. Sounds like we're getting a bit light on the wheels, so just starting to come back on the yoke. And you can see there the Caribou pretty capable, getting off in a fairly short distance there. So that takeoff run felt pretty good overall. Take the gear up, we do have positive climb. And we'll just continue to climb away here up through 500 feet, and then we can start thinking about retracting the flaps. And just coming up through 500 feet, so we'll start retracting the flaps, back through to flaps 15. Yeah, so far the aircraft feeling pretty good. Just pitch the nose down slightly, build up a little bit more speed here in the climb. Slightly bumpy conditions here off the hills. The aircraft is getting knocked around a little. Come through, retract the flaps fully. Caribou doesn't seem to be in a hurry to accelerate here. We're only doing around 500 feet per minute rate of climb. Just starting to build up some airspeed now that we've got those flaps retracted. We'll get our speed up to around 150 knots there, and then we'll make our turn. Come back to climb power. We'll make a right-hand turn, most of the high terrain off on our left. Slightly clearer ground off on the right. Okay, speed's looking good now. Start reducing, we'll come back to 40 inches manifold pressure. We'll go with 2,500 RPMs for now. That's still within the red band. Not sure whether or not that would be a typical climb power setting. Showing a decent indication there on the thrust gauges in terms of a climb power setting. You'll notice we're a little bit low on the thrust gauges during the takeoff. We're obviously at a reasonable aerodrome elevation here, so I suspect that would account for some of the loss in thrust. Anyway, speed looking good now. We're getting about 800 feet per minute rate of climb out of the aircraft. A little bit less than the information provided with the Caribou on the sales page suggested, but again we are at some altitude here. Anyway, for the after takeoff checklist, gear is up, lights are out, flaps are up, climb power is set, auto feather can come off, and radar not required. Not entirely sure that it's actually modelled in the aircraft. So just coming through a southerly heading, we're looking for 201 on the course, but obviously we're out to the right of course currently, so we'll come on to a heading of around 220, actually get us back on course. DME there showing about 11 miles to run, which is reasonable. It's about 12 miles to the station from Tekapo. Yeah, so far quite enjoying hand flying the aircraft. Maybe just a touch sensitive on the controls, but overall it does have some inertia to it. It does feel somewhat like a lumbering beast to fly. Certainly needing quite a bit of trim here. Been progressively putting in trim input since we departed, still doing so at the moment for pitch. Maybe some of the gauges as well, just a little bit hard to read. Yeah, it looks good on the heading for now. We'll just wait then until we come over the station. We can get a good idea of that with the DME. And then we'll be tracking over towards Queenstown. Again, lots of manual flying in the Caribou. As best I can tell, there's no autopilot, as we discussed. If someone knows any better, please do let me know in the comments, and I'll pin the comments so that everyone else can see. Just coming up through 6,000, we're looking to level off at 10,000 today. That'll keep us above the terrain. And just coming up again on those throttles to maintain 40 inches manifold pressure. Again, a little bit tricky to read the panels here, so we might just take some lighting. Those rear stats are pretty painfully slow. We've got pilot and engine lighting, switch and emergency roof not required. Radio console will take on as well. Just come all the way up on that rear stat for the pilot lighting. Doesn't seem to make a huge difference. Maybe slightly better there on the attitude indicator. They're just coming through 6 DME now. Mount Mary, I believe the VOR is located just off the edge of the water there. So at the moment we seem to be getting around 500-600 feet per minute rate of climb, which is a little bit less than I was expecting. I seem to recall the sales information said the aircraft could get up to around 1,300 feet per minute rate of climb. Got a reasonable load on board though, if I recall correctly. We've got some weight down the back. And we were a ton or so, I believe, below max takeoff weight. Just using a little bit of rudder trim here as well. The aircraft feeling a little bit left wing heavy currently, so correcting for that. And again, we'll keep adjusting our power levers. That's full throttle now. and just starting to lose manifold pressure, coming up through 7,000 feet, showing 155 knots over the ground, and showing about 3 miles now to run towards Mount Mary. Course inbound towards Queenstown is going to be 207 initially, although we'll be adjusting that later on. We'll talk about that during the arrival brief. There's 207. So I think perhaps the aircraft is slightly underperforming at the moment, but again that's based on very limited information. As best I can tell, there's no manual available with the product, so currently making do with a real-world checklist. There is a lot of real-world documentation out there for the Caribou from what I could see, so certainly it would be possible to go away and look up the performance figures, but I haven't had the time to do that yet. Anyway, that covers us for the departure. We'll just continue the climb here, about an hour I think it is, here in the cruise. We'll certainly be making our way en route over towards Queenstown with some absolutely beautiful scenery to see, and we'll check out again the external model of the Caribou a little bit more. And as usual, I'll come back to you once we're ready to make the approach. We can brief that up and fly the arrival. So welcome back to the flight deck. As promised, some pretty stunning scenery en route. We're now just approaching Queenstown. As you can see, currently tracking in on the 223 radial, showing about 18 miles to run. And as we discussed, we're going to be flying the Queenstown VOR DME-B approach. Again, visual conditions more or less, but we'll just use that as a reference to make our way in towards the airport. So we'll just run through that briefly. We've got the Queenstown VOR tuned up on a frequency of 113.6. On approach course will be 260, we'll set that later on. Going down to an MDA of call it 4,300 feet. But again, going to be visual there before we reach that. Fairly high aerodrome elevation, we're looking at around 1,200 feet. Just keeping an eye there on that DME for the DME arc in just a moment's time. We need to make a missed approach. It's tracking 260 to Queenstown VOR, then left turn outbound. Climbing up to 6,500 feet initially, and then 8,500 feet, max 160 knots. Definitely not going to be an issue for us in the Caribou. We're just tracking in on the 223 radial currently. We'll be turning left momentarily onto a 12 DME arc, just coming up on 14 DME. And if anyone remembers from my last video in the Cessna 414, we'll anticipate the turn here, so we'll use 1% of our ground speed, currently 164 knots, so we'll turn about 1.5 miles early, so the turn just coming up now. So making a left turn, putting ourselves 90 degrees to the station. We can also start a descent now down to 8,500 feet. So we'll just come slightly back on the power here. I do wonder if the aircraft isn't a little bit underpowered. We were using climb power settings essentially throughout the cruise and only getting around 140 knots. So that seems to be a little bit off to me. Anyway, we can set 260 now in anticipation of tracking inbound towards Queenstown. And we're now at the station 90 degrees off, showing around 13 DME, so just slightly outside of the arc. So we'll just come around 20 degrees in towards the station here, and that'll bring us slightly closer in terms of our DME. And again, we'll get the aircraft coming down. Since we're descending, we'll come back to auto rich on the mixtures.
Yankee Sierra Charlie, contact approach on 124.2.
Okay, showing 12.5 DME now. And the aircraft descending nicely now, around 1,000 feet per minute. We'll just reduce that slightly. We'll set the heading bug as well for 260. Yeah, so we've discussed the missed approach. It'll be 160 knots if we need to go around. But again, not anticipating that we'll need to today since we're clearly visual. Obviously significant high terrain around Queenstown. The MSA, high sector MSA, 11,400 feet. In terms of the weather, obviously just a little bit of light cloud coverage around, but still a very pleasant day overall. And looking good now, showing 12 DME. So we'll plan to land. We've got a slight wind, slight tailwind coming out towards the west, but it's a straight approach then. It's only around 4 knots tailwind. And again, the Caribou is pretty stall capable overall. So we'll plan to land out towards the west, vacating off to the left. Just coming down through 10,000 feet, we'll get the landing lights on. And in terms of our fuel states, down to around £1,400 now in each main tank. Looking good in terms of that DME arc. And about 245 there on the radial currently, so not too much longer we'll be turning inbound. 260. We'll just continue around in the DME arc, just coming down through 10,000s. Once we come through the 061 radial, we can descend down to 7,100 feet. And we're just through that now, so we can descend down to 7,100. So you can see here, we're just making bites at the turn. Every time we turn in slightly, that's going to decrease our distance towards the station. If we were slightly too close, we just stay on our heading. And here comes the bar there on the OBS. So we're getting ready to turn now onto course of 260. I'll anticipate that slightly, so we'll commence the turn inbound towards Queenstown.
Approach 124.2, cheers. Clear.
And we should see the field somewhere out at 2 o'clock. You can see the approach basically brings us in down the valley.
Yankee Sierra Charlie is passing 4,000 for 4,500. Yankee Sierra Charlie, Allied approach, shutdown.
And as you can see, we've got a bit of a basin down here in the mountains, so we can use that to manoeuvre. Still a touch high here currently, around 9,500, so we've got another 7,500 feet to lose. In terms of distance to the field, we've got about 10 miles. And since we do have quite a bit of altitude here to lose, there's no real benefit of coming in on straight approach. We'll be flying around, burning up some track miles for the sake of it, so we might as well come in landing with our headwind. So we'll just track overhead the field, we'll turn back towards the runway out over the water. Obviously in reality all of this would be dictated by our air traffic control clearance, but again, for the sake of 4 knots, we're not too worried about which direction we land, but we might as well land into wind since we've got to increase our track miles anyway. I don't believe the Caribou is pressurised, hence why we're keeping the descent rate reasonably low here, otherwise we could have done a bit of a dirty dive and got ourselves nicely onto a profile, but we couldn't commence the descent any earlier there with the terrain. You can see the airfield now just coming up over the ridge line off on our left. Runway just coming into view.
Starting out the power alpha, you've left control area, control and identification services terminated, squawk and frequency change approved. Total frequency change approved, Romeo power alpha.
So as we're on RC vision now, we can disregard the rest of the approach chart. We can just run through the before landing checks. So no smoking and fasten seatbelt signs, they are still on. We didn't turn those off throughout the flight, obviously not really relevant today. Carb air induction switches once again are set to alternate. Ordinarily we'd have the carb heats on as well at this fairly low power setting, but we're not going to do that today since I don't have a hardware key bound. I'm not in fact sure that you can. Mixture control levers are set to auto rich. Fuel boost pumps are set to normal. Fuel tank selector is set to normal. Hydraulics, we are now up at 3000 psi, so now reading correctly. There must be a little bit of an issue there, just with the engines providing enough grunt there at low power settings. The checklist calls for the nose wheel steering switch to be on. I assume that would be this switch. It's currently inoperative, but the nose wheel steering works regardless. So we'll just hug the side of the hills. As I say, we'll continue our descent out over the water and then bring ourselves back in towards the east. We'll turn in a little bit early here and see if we can't demonstrate the Caribou's short field capabilities in terms of approach. Probably end up a bit high, but we'll try and get the aircraft down as best we can.
Same Tango India, now November, the change is temperature 31 QNH 1013.
It's a little bit tricky to describe the Caribou's handling characteristics. It feels fairly lumbering. Equally though, we are getting a little bit bashed around here by some turbulence. And the controls still have that slightly Microsoft Flight Simulator feel to them. But overall, certainly enjoying flying the aircraft. Don't know how accurate it is, but it is good fun. I tried the Z keybind on the way over to see whether or not there was any sort of autopilot. Didn't seem to be. So it was all manual flying, which again is great fun, but it might not be everyone's cup of tea. So if you plan to do some longer trips, it's going to keep you fairly busy. We'll get the speed back through 120, we'll take the gear down. It's quite amazing how slowly you can actually operate the Caribou. And on that note, actually, we'll just keep the speed up for now. We're looking good on profile, we don't want to drag the aircraft all the way in. So once again, coming back up on those power levers. As I say, I was planning to take the gear there, but since it's going to take us quite a while now to get back towards the runway, we might as well hold off. We'll keep 130 knots for now. As I say, no manual with the aircraft, which is a shame, but you do have in-sim checklist, and you can see as well we do have basic checklist provided on the aircraft itself, which is a nice touch. And as I say, I'm using a paper checklist for the sake of our flight today. So just coming down through 3,300 feet, still doing that 140 knots. We'll slowly start reducing that speed now back to 120 so we can take the gear. Looks like we're still showing 4 whites there on the PAPI.
Tango India clear coastal, offshore, southbound. Not above 500, current limit energetic, KNH 1013. Clear coastal, offshore, southbound, not above 500, clearance limit of Hanley Jetty 1013, Lima Tango India.
Okay, so speed is checked, gear can come down. And we do have 3 greens. Definitely a little bit high here now, so we'll just come straight through full flap. And good on the speed. There's flaps 40. That should give us plenty of drag, help get us back down towards the runway. Misjudge that slightly, as I say, we're quite high now. We'll keep an eye though on that approach speed indicator, still showing fast at the moment, which is pretty amazing. We're down at 80 knots. If nothing else, I suppose this is a decent demonstration the Caribou's short field approach capabilities. Getting around 1500 feet per minute rate of descent out of the aircraft, not actually picking up any speed. That's pretty impressive. Then we're running through our finals checks. Pitch is full fine, undercarriage is down, flaps are set. Landing clearance not required, the runway is clear. We'll see how we go here. We'll try and vacate first right. Again, just to check the performance of the Caribou. Otherwise, they will just have to roll through. I'm having to take off some of that rudder trim now as well with the power levers right back. I'm actually wondering just how slow we have to get before that indicator comes in. Okay, so just coming off the stops of the needle there. Quite a crosswind actually, it wasn't in the real world METAR, only around 4 knots as I say. Looking at the windsock there, it's reasonably gusty. So just getting away with that one, just coming back onto profile. Don't think we're going to make that first exit without slamming it down, but we'll try. There's touchdown, straight into the reverse range on the props, fully onto the brakes. Oh, there you go. Caribou, absolutely no issues there. Probably slowed down a little bit unrealistically, but that was max braking, max reverse. So pretty impressive stopping distance. So hopefully at least there we've demonstrated during the flight that the Caribou has some pretty amazing stall characteristics. I don't know how true they are to real life. I know the Caribou is pretty capable, but I think that might be just a little bit overdone. Anyway, for the afterlanding checks, we'll close up the gust lock once again. Landing lights can go off. We'll just make our way straight towards the terminal. Carb air induction switches will leave as is, flaps can come up. Mixtures can come back to auto lean. And we'll just hold the checks there till we come onto the bay. And we can stop just short. So part brake on, continuing with the checks, fuel boost pumps are off, windshield heat again inoperative, anti-collision light will leave on until we've got the engines shut down. De-icing switches, pitot heat can come off. Radio switches, you can leave the radios as is. So nose wheel centered, parking brake on. For the shutdown, again we'll set the throttles 1200 RPM. Not entirely sure what the purpose of this gauge is supposed to be. It doesn't seem to pick up any data from the GPS. so it's a little bit limited in terms of its functionality. We've got 1200 set. We should let the engines cool back towards 200 degrees or below on the cylinder heads. We're down at 150. So radio switches are set. Inverter switch is off. Fasten seatbelt and no smoking signs are both off. And mixture control levers can come back to idle cutoff. Shut down the right first. Pretty nice shutdown sounds there. And same on the left. Fairly abrupt shutdown. So mixture control levers are in idle cutoff. Ignition switches are both off. Fuel tank selector switch will leave as is. And battery master switch is off. So there you go guys, I do hope you enjoyed our New Zealand outing in the local legend that is the DHC-4 Caribou. I have to say both the world update and the aircraft are to my mind a bit of a triumph by Asobo. I really enjoyed both on an individual basis, but as I say, put together I thought they made an absolutely cracking combination and made for a brilliant flight. We'll touch briefly on World Update 12, we'll then move on to the aircraft and my overall thoughts on the product. Once again, as someone that really enjoys flying NZ in the sim, it was really nice to see New Zealand get its own world update, and generally speaking, I think Asobo have done a really nice job. Obviously, we only saw a small part of the scenery today, we didn't check out any of the custom points of interest, but certainly the terrain mesh looks excellent. There does seem to be a slightly different aesthetic to some of the terrain mesh, which I particularly noticed on the way in towards Queenstown. I'm not sure whether or not that's by design. Personally, I thought it looked really good from a distance, but perhaps a little bit unusual up close. Really, my only other gripe with World Update 12, the selection of airports that were chosen as the handcrafted airports are somewhat limited and perhaps slightly strange choices there as well. For example, pretty much all of the major airports in New Zealand are still stock. No Auckland update, no Christchurch update. I was quite surprised to see that, and whilst there are some great payware options out there for most of those airports, in terms of freeware it seemed to be pretty limited choice currently. Otherwise though, again, very happy with World Update 12, and I'm sure it's an area I'll be spending a lot more time in within the sim. Moving on to the Caribou then, as I said, it's an aircraft that I really ended up enjoying despite my initial reservations. Is the DHC-4 perfect? No, it's not, but it is a very unique, very interesting, and actually very well modelled aircraft. It does have some flaws, and we'll discuss those in a minute, but given the price, I think the aircraft is an absolute bargain overall. I would highly recommend it if this is, of course, your sort of flying. As usual, we'll get the negatives out of the way, move through to the positives. For me, the Caribou is missing just one or two features which we generally expect now in the sim, but again do bear in mind the price point. There's no onboard tablet, no external fixtures or fittings as best I can tell, and similarly I didn't seem to be able to remove the pilot models. None of those are big issues for me personally, but again they are features that you generally see even on the cheaper add-ons these days. And certainly it would have been nice to be able to fit chocks, pitot covers, things of that nature. It would have been brilliant as well to have visible cargo down the back, but again those sorts of things are, as I said earlier, icing on the cake. And at this sort of price, I can happily let those sorts of things slide. Another omission with the product, at least as best I could tell, I couldn't find a manual. I did dig around in the aircraft folders. I also looked online as Asobo have published certain local legends manuals available on the website, but again I couldn't find anything there. I suspect we may get a manual at a later date, but it is somewhat disappointing to have a relatively complex aircraft release and very little guidance on how to fly it. As I mentioned, you do get the in-sim checklists, and it is possible as well to find real-world documentation, but of course ideally you don't want to be relying on that when purchasing an add-on. In terms of the aircraft sounds, overall I thought those were pretty good, but there were a couple of areas which fell slightly short. Certain cockpit controls were missing sounds, noticeably for example the gust lock. It'd be nice to have a big mechanical clunk there when moving that. Generally speaking the engine sounds were pretty decent, but it did rather depend on the power range. Certainly at low power the engines sound a bit meek. You'll notice as well during the landing there with the throttles almost back at idle, again the sound's rather lackluster, even going to full reverse. I don't expect that we'll see an improvement to the sound pack, so you'll probably have to live with what's already there, but again overall I think the sounds do hold up pretty well. And lastly, we touched on it a couple of times, particularly during the climb. It feels to me as though the aircraft is perhaps slightly underpowered versus the performance data that at least I saw there on the sales page. We did of course take off with a little bit of elevation there, around 2,500 feet, and we were reasonably loaded. But I was still quite surprised to see the Caribou struggling to accelerate initially and then really only getting around 500-600 feet per minute rate of climb. That may or may not be true to life, I'll leave that down to you, but at least we've demonstrated the numbers here in some sense. And on a similar note, as I mentioned during the cruise, we had to use a fairly high power setting, at least based on the thrust percentage gauge, in order to keep up a reasonable speed. Otherwise though, not really a whole lot that I can say that's negative about the aircraft. Again, I am keeping in mind here the cost of the product overall. Of course there are some systems missing fidelity, but I would certainly expect that here, and overall I was very pleasantly surprised with the level of complexity of the Caribou. Textures as well we touched on during the walk around. There are some textures that could look slightly better, but I think the aircraft looks great overall, very nicely weathered, looks very authentic. Decent PBR as well. Under the right lighting conditions the aircraft does look very photorealistic. In terms of FPS, the Caribou, pretty decent performance there overall. I was getting about 57 FPS in the Caribou versus around 70 in the default Cessna 152. Just before we move on to the positives, we'll touch on a couple of other areas of the aircraft that we've yet to look at. So firstly, looking at the night lighting. The night lighting is perhaps a slightly weaker area of the aircraft. We have instrument backlighting, as you'd expect, and again it looks okay overall. We also have a dome light located at the rear of the cockpit, and again it looks decent, but nothing special. Of course the Caribou is a big old radial twin, so we'll just carry out a very quick demonstration here as well of an engine failure. I'll demonstrate as well feathering of the prop. So here we are, nicely established in the cruise once again, maintaining around 10,700 feet currently. We'll shut down the number 1 engine for the demonstration here, as obviously we can visually identify that quite easily. You'll see the animation. To induce the failure, we'll just cut the fuel to the number 1. And you can see there, losing the thrust, we've got the low fuel pressure warning light. The RPM's just rolling off slightly as well. Not a whole lot of swing there with the engine failed, just putting in a small amount of right rudder there to centre up the ball. The aircraft's still very controllable. The RPM's still rolling off. We'll feather up the prop. You can see now the RPM really rolling back. And we'll just visually watch the prop there as it runs down. So as you can see, we can feather the prop. I'm not entirely sure about the prop animation there. It doesn't look to be quite the right angle to be feathered to me. A little bit tricky to see from here. But nevertheless, a reasonable animation there, and you can see the prop just windmilling slightly in the wind. We'll come fully up again on the RPMs and the power lever on the number 2. And even with that, still not much issue in terms of controllability. Again, just a little bit of right rudder, keeping everything nicely centred. Down at around 10,500 feet now, maintaining about 120 knots it seems here, on a single engine. Although to be fair, we do still have around 200 feet per minute rate of descent. So as you can see, the emergency fuel shutoff valve works there, same there for the feathering of the prop. And once again, overall I was very pleasantly surprised by the level of systems depth included with the Caribou. Certainly I would say it's well above and beyond what we've seen from any of the other local legends or famous flyers to date. Of course it's not a study level aircraft and there are systems that are inoperative, but I was actually pretty surprised to see how closely I could follow the checklist, and even some slightly more complex system procedures seem to work out quite nicely as well. So systems, again, especially taking into account the price, certainly get a thumbs up from me. In terms of the aircraft flight modelling, a little bit trickier to nail down there, as the DHC-4 is unlike anything I've ever flown in the real world. Once again, the aircraft does certainly feel like a big burly airframe, perhaps lacking a bit as well in aerodynamic finesse. Perhaps just a little bit overly susceptible to turbulence, but that seems to be an issue in the sim currently with most aircraft. I found myself needing only very minor control inputs initially to enact a change in direction, but actually to get the aircraft through a turn, needing some fairly significant inputs there. I think the best aircraft I could compare the DHC-4 to is the Big Radial's Grumman Goose in terms of how the aircraft flies. The takeoff was interesting. As usual, I would say the rudder was slightly overly sensitive, but it was pretty easy to keep the aircraft on the centre line. The DHC-4 as well started to feel quite light on the wheels at relatively low airspeeds, but going off that airspeed indicator gauge, it seems that around 80 knots is a pretty typical speed to be flying the Caribou, and certainly that takes some getting used to. I think I was flying the aircraft a little bit fast in general. The aircraft took quite a bit of trimming, but I found once I had it trimmed out, it was fairly stable. As we've discussed, no autopilot as best I can tell, so again, lots of hand flying if you do want to pick up the Caribou. That can be a plus point for some, a negative point for others. Sounds we've already touched on. Overall I think the sounds are good, it really just depends on which range of the sounds you're listening to. Generally in the cruise the aircraft sounds pretty nice. The sounds are perhaps a bit muted though. I had them cranked all the way up here in the video, whereas typically during the editing process I have to tone them back quite a bit to match up with my speaking volume. So it would be nice to see some improvements to the engine sound. Certainly as well I hope we do see the addition of a few more cockpit control sounds. There are just only one or two that are missing. Great though that the developer has even gone to the level of detail of including sounds for the ramp, and again the ramp is a nice touch. It's great to have that sort of functionality in the sim, even if you're not going to have much use for it. Graphically, overall I do like the aircraft. I think the modelling is very good, both internally and externally. Texturing externally very good as well, and internally I really like the feel that's been created with the Caribou. Again, it's an unusual aircraft in general, certainly within the cockpit, quite a vintage layout in terms of systems architecture, but for me that certainly makes it all the more enjoyable to operate. As I mentioned during the introduction, I wasn't necessarily expecting to enjoy the Caribou all that much, but the aircraft has completely thrown away my expectations. I really like what's been done with the DHC-4 overall, especially given the price. And for me, this is exactly what a local legend or a famous flyer should be. An unusual aircraft, one that we probably wouldn't see from another developer, but done to a very high standard and made at a very affordable price. Hats off to Asobo on this one. I really enjoyed the aircraft and I'm sure we'll be taking it out again at a later date. Once again, I do hope you all enjoyed the video. If you did, then please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. To those who support the channel, either via Patreon or becoming a channel member, as always, my sincere thanks, it is hugely appreciated. And to all of you, I do hope you're having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.